everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Heathen Bitches podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Glade, and today we have with me my friend Fish.
And my friend Sigrun.
Pain.
And today we have a very special guest coming in to talk to us about localization and folklore. Give a warm round of applause, even though they can't hear you, because this is a recording for Hrethric. How do you say your name?
You did it. You did good. Everyone's going to say it differently. Fish can't say it at all, so you might as well just...
All right.
It's true. I just say Red Richard.
Yeah, we got Little Richard over here.
Okay, my name is Hrethric, not Richard. Not Little Richard, not Red Richard. I own an Ash community on Discord. It's called Hefenfelth. It's a nice little community full of nice people like Sigrun, not Fishy.
I'm there, I'm just not nice.
Yeah, it's really mean. Together, we have been sort of working on... We don't have like a website or anything like that. We're just kind of snowballing Ash content amongst ourselves. But one thing we have been trying to work into Ash a lot is folklore, localization, and maybe bias, but I think we've done a pretty good job.
Hell yeah. Yeah,
especially
honestly, yeah.
With the likes of Brock, you know? Brock's practice is really cool.
We're probably going to talk about that at some point in the episode, too.
Yeah. You know, shout outs to Brock for his absolute fantastic shit.
In the real world, I am in the study. You ready for this? I am in the study of musology. Whoa.
Nerd shit.
It's a fancy word for museum studies and heritage studies. Do that at the University of Leicester School of Museum Studies, and it's really cool. It's a master's degree, so it means I'm pretty smart. Just saying.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So that's Hrethric. How can they find your community?
It's only on Discord. Yeah, if you could put it in the description. Yeah, but it's a Discord-only community at the minute. We do have a wiki that we've been working on, but there's only like 3-4 things on there at the minute, so...
Based and Woden-pilled. So today, we're going to be talking a little bit about folklore and localization. And the first thing I kind of want to talk about, Hreth, you would describe yourself as a folklorist? What's that mean?
That's a good question. A question that is timeless, because the standard dictionary of folklore, okay, from 1949, was sort of the first literature on folkloristics, and they could not decide on a definition of folklorist, or folklore for that matter. So when you read that, there's between 20 to 30 definitions of what that actually is. Ultimately, it is a person that is devoted to the study of folklore as a legitimate discipline. Whether it is a discipline can be argued. That's through the identification, documentation, characterization, or preservation of those traditional expressive forms found within folkloristics. There are people who are academically trained in that background, like Robert George is and Michael Owen Jones, but they come from like an anthropological or ethnological background. A degree isn't required to be a folklorist. A general awareness of who you are and what is around you is.
So how does folklore intersect with, like, your heathen praxis?
It doesn't, mate.
It doesn't. Oh, shit. That's the end of the episode, folks. It's been great talking to you, Hrethric. Tune in next time to the Heathen Bitches podcast when we're going to have Robert Sass on his podcast. It's the Sasscast, baby.
I will teleport to Florida right now with a hammer.
Oh, please! I would love to add that hammer to my collection. No, but for real, how does folklore relate to your heathen praxis?
Ultimately, it makes heathenry a lot more personable for me, and I think for many other people that do it, it's really good way to ground yourself. Now, as heathens, we are super infatuated with the oral traditions of other peoples that we are super quick to forget our own. And if you're a Reconstructionist but find yourself stopping at things that are purely written down by Catholic monks rather than exploring like the full spectrum of lore, you're doing yourself like a huge disservice and neglecting a big factor of heathen practice, which is the applicability of belief. When we add like a folkloric overlay to our heathenry, it brings us back home. I'm no longer in the mountains of Scandinavia fighting giants. I'm back in the English countryside.
It's deep. I can relate. I can relate because where I'm at, you look at the shit that's in like the Eddas, because I'm fucking a Norse head,
So,
and it's like, shit, that's cool. I don't almost feel weird doing that here because there's nothing taller than, I don't know, a 2-story building, other than maybe a 3-story building, and it's fucking wet and hot. It's a whole different world. Need something to ground it in what I'm living in, to make it feel more, not to make it feel more tangible, but to make it make more sense for me to be doing it.
You don't have like seasons the same way that Scandinavia does.
No, I got 2 seasons, wet and dry. I joke around. Of course, there's the 4 seasons, but they don't really happen. It stays green all year round. The biggest change is like we got hurricane season, and then the big whippy winds go through. They go whoosh, and then once they're gone, it's like, well, it's dry time. Guess we're gonna be still very moist, but less rainy for like 6 months. I mean, it doesn't snow here.
So like your difference in just geography and climate is going to basically require some level of localization just based on the fact that just the seasons don't work the same way that they do in, say, Scandinavia. So it's not going to translate the same way.
Yeah. I think before we touch on that, though, we might want to look back at folklore a little bit more before we move on, because I'd love to talk about that. So how have you? I know you said that doing incorporating folklore into your practices made it come home, made it feel more whole and succinct as a practice. But what are some ways that you've been doing this?
Mostly with holidays and festivities. There's a lot around me that are quite unique. I live in Cumbria, so it's sort of in what was the borderlands of Scotland and England. So there's a lot of cool stuff here from both sides of the border. And one of those things is a tradition called the Rapper's Sword. It's interpreted differently, village by village, but it's ultimately a harvest ritual dance that involves dancing with swords. Obviously, undeniably pagan, right? And it's harmless to incorporate into a heathen practice. So I've just taken little things like that from near me, little holidays and festivities, and put them into my practice to give it a bit more life. Other than that, I include folkloric beings like the red cap, the mud cap, the greenies, will-o'-the-wisp, and I venerate them like any other white.
And it helps with myth building too. Like I know you sent me an article the other day about a folklore story about a giant throwing the man in the moon up into the sky, which was like a potential origin story for like an Ashmona.
Well, that's why folklore is so important, right? And without going too much into ashy stuff, that alone, that little story, it comes from the forest Yrnagate, which means Etin wood, which completely undermines what we know as Anglo-Saxon heathens now. I mean, I know you talked about this in your last podcast, so again, I won't go into it too much, but
yeah,
this whole sort of dynamic of giant bad, we have so much folklore in England across the British Isles that says giant good, giant creator, giant protect. When you include those stories, it sort of warps your heathenry a lot. It makes you see your cosmology a lot different. Ultimately, it localizes us. I mean, that's not to say that every Anglo-Saxon heathen's interpretation of a giant has to be the same, but it's cool knowing that my interpretation of a giant is different from yours because of that localization. It's a luxury in its own way.
And there's an argument to be made that, like, say we're constructing a praxis that might, in our attempt to look like what if heathenry hadn't died out, what would it look like today? That they would have built their stories based on the stories that were already around them anyway.
Yeah. I mean, folklore at its roots, it's like the history of ancient belief that did not make it into the books of Beda and Tacitus. It's still just as valid as what is written down. It's just told orally.
There's a lot of folklore that probably has roots in, like, heathen times that just survived by the story changing over time.
Yeah, 100%. Like, hoodening is a big one in southern England. That's when it's traced back is a midwinter ram ritual, and it's still celebrated today by everyone in Derbyshire floating a giant model of a ram in the air and burning it. They walk through the streets. Just because somebody didn't write this down and say, whoa, the pagans did this, does not make it unpagan. It's still just as valid.
It reminds me of the Yule goat in Sweden that they can never keep from burning before the actual Yule.
Oh, hell yeah, the Gavla goat. Every time it doesn't burn, the world gets fucked, so you know.
You have to burn it.
You have to. It's interesting hearing you talk about the way that folklore influences your practice from a place where, because, like, there's been people in England for a very long time.
A little bit.
Over here in the US, there's, like, native traditions. Those are closed. And then you've got not much else.
We've got folklore. It's just, you know, less necessarily rooted in pagan tradition, I guess you would say.
Mm-hmm. Like, you might have Paul Bunyan or Johnny Appleseed. Or in my case here in Florida, we've got shit like the Spanish conquistadors finding the Fountain of Youth. Or the town where I live being settled by pirates, which is not historically accurate, but it's the folk tale about the place. So it's interesting that there's, I don't know, I think that there's ways that you can still have these influences in your praxis and make it more centered around your home and your hearth without having to necessarily live someplace where there's a lot more of an abundance of folk tale and tradition.
That's what we were talking about Brock earlier. That's pretty much Brock's entire praxis is reframing, like, Germanic myths in a way that flows with his local folklore in Texas. So it's like Texas heathenry.
Yeah. Heathen cowboy.
Caldenry?
Calvinry.
Oh.
And you've done some myth building with your local folklore too, haven't you, Glade?
No. Absolutely not. Yeah, I've done some. It's not much. Like I mentioned, the Fountain of Youth thing. That's something I'm working on right now. Trying to make it into like a cautionary tale. It's really interesting. But my localization has a lot more to do with reframing the gods and the holidays and the seasons. Yeah, I mean it's much more around trying to look at, you know, hey, I don't live in Iron Age Scandinavia. I need a praxis that works in Florida. And so if that means that Freyr is riding around through the swamp on a boat, then that means Freyr is riding around on a swamp on a boat.
Swamp Freyr.
It's interesting because he kind of ends up filling this role of like wandering caretaker, which I think is, in my experience with Freyr, is a very fitting kind of role to situate in. Yeah. I still celebrate Yule and Sigrun and things that don't really make a ton of sense for where I'm at, right? Like these celebrations I still find are valuable because it helps me connect with heathens at large, but they don't have the same, you know, it's not the same meaning, right? Winter is not this harsh thing that could spell the end of my life or the life of a loved one, and so I need a celebration to cheer myself up through, to hold out for the new year. It's not the same, but I also hold a bloat around the start of hurricane season, I have a ritual designed for when a strong hurricane is about to hit.
Oh yeah, we did that one.
Yeah, we did that one over at the Hold. And likewise, I have a ritual that I do in mid-November when hurricane season closes out and we enter the dry season as a celebration of making it through what is the hardest time of the year, a celebration of the gifts of the gods and the, I don't want to say peace, because it is not, hurricane season is never peaceful, even if the hurricanes don't come, but in the shelter and grace that now the rest of the year is free to prepare, free to celebrate and live life before having to batten down the hatches again next June.
So for you, like, hurricane season is almost more closely akin to what winter would have been historically, because it's the danger season.
Yeah, yes, that is a good way of saying it, because it's not like spring is an especially good time here. It's about the same amount of good times as any other time, but the hurricane season, which isn't really one season, it's two, is very much a point of danger. You know, instead of blizzards, we've got hurricanes and tornadoes. Yeah. And so consequently, it ends up being that looking at deities that are more closely related to those aspects of nature that you find in Scandinavia, like Skathi, heavily tied with the mountains and with skiing. If I'm not incorrect, I do think skiing is a Skathi thing. That's not here, right? And so looking at a praxis with Skathi starts to almost end up with Skathi becoming almost akin to like a fisherman's deity or a trapper, because that's the kind of hunting you can do here. That's the kind of situation where you might be out of your element. In the water is not where people are meant to be, yet we have to do that in search of food and sustenance. And so I find that to be something that would translate over to Skathi. Or like going out into the swamp is not... As much as I love the swamp, we aren't meant to be there. It doesn't want us there.
That's part of the reason, like, I have Uller in my praxis as an Anglo-Saxon heathen, is because we have usually like 1 or 2 snows a year here, but whenever it does happen, it's a huge fucking deal. Nobody knows how to drive in it, and all the bread and milk sells out, and so we usually do like a small protective ritual to Uller.
That's rad. The bread and milk dries out? Or did I not hear you right?
Yeah, no, that's the thing here. If there's a slight chance of snow in the forecast, all of the bread and all of the milk in every grocery store will sell out.
Oh, sell out. For some reason, I thought you said dried out. I'm like, what? You've got powdered milk?
Yeah, no, it just dries. It dries up, disappears.
It dries up. Damn.
It's the dry season.
It's the dry season. But I think localization ends up being really important for creating a fulfilling practice, because you can have a solid heathen practice without doing any localization. You can.
You also miss out on a lot.
You lose that opportunity if you don't participate in localization. You end up losing this opportunity to do what I think is core to heathenry, and I would argue core to many pagan religions, but very much so heathenry, is this relation with your land and the spirits there. If you're always putting them in terms compared to, you know, Scandinavia for myself or British Isles, like, I'm not trying to say that you can't have a good relationship with the land without it, but it's not, I find meaning it on its own terms is a fulfilling task.
And a lot of my localization so far has been like really, really hyper local, because I live on old farmland and mining land, so there's a lot of interesting like landmarks and things that I've sort of incorporated into my praxis with like their own little lore.
Cool. Hyper local is awesome.
Yeah.
I think when we think as Reconstructionists, what we do with localization is probably more accurate to what an ancient belief system was like. That every tribe had their own localized belief. Sure, they probably had a similar pantheon of gods, but given their location, what they were gods of may have been different. Like, if I had a mountain god, I wouldn't know how to venerate it being in a place with no mountains. So I would have to adapt that mountain god to what is around me.
Yeah, there's a good chance that these different tribes may have had the same gods, but say that mountain god to a different tribe that didn't live near mountains would have looked completely different.
Right? Yeah. And, you know, mountains are a thing of myth anyway. They don't exist. So
yeah, they're myth.
Everyone
true.
has to adapt to that.
I've never seen one.
It's true. When I look out my window and I see the towering Rockies, it's fake. It's a phantasm of my mind.
It's a backdrop.
It's an illusion.
It is an Etten illusion. That needs to be a shirt. That's a great band name too, Etten Illusion. You do some psych rock to that.
Oh
A little psych rock folk. A little psych rock folk metal. You know? I don't know where I'm going with that. Anywho, part of the thing that stops a lot of people from doing localization is they've got this mindset where they look at the myth as if the ancient people who had these relationships and created these stories that were eventually recorded by Christian monks and politicians fucking centuries after it had any religious importance to the people living there. They look at these as if they were somehow closer to the gods, or as if they start their process of myth building or localization, that they're somehow like perverting heathenry, or they're moving away from what is actually heathenry and creating some filthy eclectic shit. I want to push back against that, because realistically, this is kind of how religion is supposed to work. We don't all live in the same places. We don't all live the same lives. And at the end of the day, we're still worshiping the same gods, just even if we look at them in a different lens. You know, it's historical. This is how it would have been done. If anything, you are bettering your reconstruction by doing so. Exactly. That's the take. I mean, unless you want to time travel to Iron Age Scandinavia and then land travel to Iron Age Scandinavia.
I think that would destroy heathenry if we saw how they actually worshipped compared to what we've made.
Oh my gosh. They'd be like riding on... No, I can't say that.
What? Wait, you can't just stop after riding on.
Ing's thing. That's how proper Sather is performed.
Oh god.
True. Completely and factually true.
Like, are we all in like a similar belief that we all assume that every single tribe in Scandinavia had the same set of gods, the same myths?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they were all exactly the same.
Like, is that what we've come to?
If you think that the people who lived in what would now be Oslo and the people who lived in what now would be Cumbria, or is always Cumbria, if you think that those people had exactly the same gods and they worshipped them the same way and told the exact same tales, what was the we already made this joke last episode. Shit, but
yeah, we talked about it last episode where we were like, you know, there was probably we were talking about Ettins, but there's probably some variants of how they were perceived, because there's variants in beliefs in tribes, and if you don't think that, you're probably wrong.
Don't say it.
I don't know what you people are talking about. The Germanic peoples from the time of the Roman Empire to the time of Adam of Bremen were the exact same. There was no change. There was nothing. They were static, completely static, and they were always Viking, berserker, chads, and they were always screaming for Odin every single day. This is truth. This is truth, and you cannot tell me wrong, because this guy in a very, very black uniform with a skull on his hat tells me so.
It's so ironic, because we as heathens, we pride ourselves on the fact we have no doctrine or creed, yet we're so against anything non-Edic.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it speaks to the fact that because there's observably different traditions in heathenry, like Road Novery and Anglo-Saxon shit and continental and what?
Anglo-Saxon shit.
You want me to call it Fern Seethu? I didn't think so.
Oh my god.
I will slap you.
You'll slap me across the ocean.
Water.
But the point was that because we've got varying traditions from Germanic peoples with very similar gods, with all but usually a name changed or some ways that we've practiced things with them. Not saying that that's all the difference. There are big differences. But if you think that those differences exist on that large scale, you have to imagine that these isolated communities, which it's a lot harder to travel 10 miles then than it is to travel 10 miles now. It's a lot harder to travel 50 miles than it is now. Like these communities, while they interact with each other, it's on a much different scale. Of course, there's communication and trade, and they're not totally isolated, but they do develop on their own. In the same way that, like, you send a kid to fucking foster school, right? He's not gonna come back and be the same kid. He's gonna be all fostered up, all schooled.
So as Reconstructionists, when we say, like, oh, we think that, say, like, the Norse or the Anglo-Saxons believed this, what we're realistically actually saying is some Norse or Anglo-Saxon tribe somewhere believed this, but not every tribe did.
The ones that got recorded, because ultimately it's a bit of a crapshoot what managed to get to fucking Snorri's ears when he wrote shit down.
Snorri gang.
Fucking Snorri. Snorri gang.
I like what Glade was saying before about having different localized practices, but we can still relate to one another. I think that's really cool that local groups can still support each other yet still maintain independent identities. Florida is different from the north of England, and that's okay. We're still heathens.
Yeah. Big part of that is swallowing your pride and being like, because as much as filthy recons, we like to be like, no, you're wrong because it's this, right? Here's the source. You got to swallow that a little bit and be willing to say, hey, that's cool what you're doing over there. I can't do it, or I don't need to do it, but I like what you're doing. Let's try and do this together.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we're more aligned on the majority of things than we are different. Core religious tenets don't change very much.
And you don't have to share lore to worship together.
No. If I had to worship with only people who practice like me, I could never worship with anyone other than me.
Yeah, most Ash think that way.
Yeah, it's true.
Catch me going to Yule being the only Ash person there.
Yeah. Well, I have an Ash friend, so.
Did he say ass person?
Yeah, ass person.
Yes. No, I did not say ass person.
That's the name of my praxis.
In what context is? Oh, I'm sorry, Fishy. I won't rail your ass person anymore.
Sigrun, do you want to share localization praxis?
Yeah, there's really not much going on here in that sort of regard. Not that I haven't been trying.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to bring up is that it's not easy.
Oh yeah, some places researching folklore gets to be a pain in the ass.
Oh yeah,
because not all the traditions are necessarily alive anymore. Like even though they were alive maybe 100 years ago.
And even outside of the folklore aspect, localization itself is kind of tricky. There's some things you got to square off in your mind first before you can even start. And then once you are starting, it's like, well, there's no handbook. It's very much like returning to when you first started your praxis. And
return to baby.
What do I do? Return to baby. That's right. You've heard of return to monkey. Now return to babe and be born anew in localization.
I think another thing worth mentioning is, this might sound a bit whack off the hook, but the ancestral connection in folklore and localization. I don't know if you guys feel this, but knowing I get to share these stories with you who would never have heard of them otherwise is really nice, and it connects me deeply on a personal level to my ancestry who would have told similar stories, albeit with different tweaks. These stories are timeless, and I feel like through reading them or listening to them, interpreting them, I get a slight glimpse of how my ancestors may have thought or behaved and acted in everyday life. By looking at certain fairy tales that have continued forever, we can see that they indeed had the same fears as us, the same wishes and the same needs.
100%, because if you can get in touch with your area in that way. You get in touch with like the history of everyone who's gone before you there, the people who first started telling those stories, the people who are the subject of those stories, especially if they're talking about folklore about certain people. It's a very wonderful level of veneration, if you ask me, to have that sort of connection via those old tales.
Storytelling is one of the few things that we do uniquely as people. I have in a place where I'm situating my whole life around the process of telling stories. I work in a creative field. There is no such thing as a story in isolation. What we do with the stories that we tell and the characters and how we portray them reflects a lot, not only about us, but about the world we want to see be made. And I think, especially with folklore, I don't have any ancestors who live where I live, at least not direct ancestors. But I've got people who lived here and were important to the construction of the life that I now live, the place that I love. And they're my ancestors too, albeit not direct. And being able to tell their stories to my own kids one day, or just to celebrate their stories, is a real tangible connection between you and the people who have made it possible for you to be where you're at. And I think that storytelling is one of the most powerful tools that we have in our arsenal for making human connection. You know, you see it in the way that we consume media. There is not a piece of media out there that people love that doesn't have a good story. Except maybe like a video game with mechanics that make the brain go brr, but that's besides the point. You make your own story with that kind of thing. In that same vein, I think that while it's a way that we can interact with each other really powerfully, I think it's a great way of interacting with the land and with our ancestors in doing, I think, one of the most human tasks, which is just talking, telling a story.
I mean, we're in an ancestor worshipping religion, right? So going back to what y'all were saying before, whether you live in a place where your own ancestors lived or not, it's a part of the place around you, like the stories and the traditions and whatnot. And so, being a part of that is being a part of something that those ancestors were a part of.
Yeah.
What Glade was saying was pretty interesting. Like, the storytelling's like a lost art, right? Like, it's kind of like a dying sort of thing. But by denying that, by not being storytellers, we're denying an essential part of our human need. Like, it's the longing for community. A big characteristic of storytelling in ancient times was the creation of community, like facilitated through myths and folktale. Through storytelling, I guess we create a sense of belonging, like a sense of personal and communal identification. It's just as important now to keep old folktales alive than it was then. These stories have stood the test of time, evidently, because we're here talking about them. We all should retell and remember them. Like Fishy said, even if their story's not from your direct ancestry, even if it's a story from across the fucking sea.
It's great because when we look at other cultures and other periods of time, the thing that we remember the most is the stories. Every mythology is a tale, is a collection of stories. Every folk tale, every song comes from a story. Like, so let's say that you are someone who you've done your digging and you can't find jack shit. There's no stories about where you live. I guess you live in the middle of Antarctica, but let's say so. There's nothing wrong with making a story. Someone had to make these, and then they change over time. A good example of this, like in history, for anyone who's still like, I can't make a story because I'm a Reconstructionist. Well, guess what? Ancient peoples made stories. Here's a really big example of it. The Festival of Dionysus in Athens included a 3-day play competition where they would write theater pieces using the gods as characters. And it was essentially the largest myth writing event in the Western world. 3 days of people writing myth making stories using the gods and the heroes and just trying to get across some sort of message or moral or even just be entertaining. It is one of the closest things you could do to practicing like ancient peoples. Is making it your own.
Yeah, myth building is valid.
Yeah. On that note, I want to thank Hrethric for coming in here and talking with us today. You've been absolutely wonderful and very insightful. Despite all the banter beforehand, you're very calm and collected, and I appreciate your words today.
Yeah, thanks.
If you want,
Richie.
Oh my god.
If you want to check out Hefenfelth, look in the description below. There's going to be a Discord link. Every single person who joins is immediately greeted by Hreth. This is a Glade fact.
True.
Glade fact.
Glade facted. You'll see us there. I know Hreth only mentioned that Fishy and Sig were there. I'm actually there too.
That is true.
I had been
Everybody's
meaning to
there.
say something, but it kind of got away from me.
With no it is an ash space.
Yeah.
So it might not be for everybody, but it is the ash space, if I may say so myself. There is not one better.
Based.
I'm inclined to agree. I've yet to see one.
Same.
And also part 2 coming soon.
Hefenfelth Part 2.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. The sequel.
So maybe there might be a different link as well for Part 2, depending on when this comes out, I guess.
Depends how lazy I am.
Yeah. So if you want, stop by, say hello to Hrethric. They're great people. I keep messing up your name. This has been the Heathen Bitches podcast. You can find us at all our regular places. I hope you've enjoyed, and we'll see you all another time.
Norse Heathenry sucks.
Norse Heathenry sucks, I guess.
And that's how we're going to end.
No. We still have to do the credit song.
We'll probably have actual music as well, but you know what? I'm